February Discovery Lab, Poop in the Ocean. And so I'm going to give a little introduction about what we are going to be doing this evening. So our guest speaker tonight is Kristen Sharpe. So many of you have probably recognized her from around the VIMS community. She's also been working at CBNERR in Virginia before as well. So once she gives her presentation, we will open it up for questions for her. And if you guys do want to ask questions during her presentation, you guys can drop that in the, you should see a Q&A tab on your Zoom call. So we would prefer you guys drop your questions in there. That way Sarah and I can see them a little bit better. And if you have any comments, you can leave that in the chat as well. After that, we will do a short introduction of Maggie and Sophia, a couple of our eco ambassadors who have helped us out the past couple months. We will be doing a Let It Marine Snow game, which is an interactive activity for you all that we're going to play live. And then a scat attack trivia. So another Kahoot game for you guys right at the end with a prize pack. So that's going to be geared more towards our younger audiences, but we'll get to that in a little bit later on. And there will be additional resources emailed out to you all after our Discovery Lab with a link to where you can find all of those wonderful resources that Maggie and Sophia created for us. And so we do have 2 more Discovery Labs left at the beginning of this year. So on March 16th, we will have another lab on oysters with Dr. Ryan Carnegie here at VIMS. And then April 20th, we will do our April one on harmful algae blooms with Marta Sanderson, also from VIMS. So we do have a couple more planned for you guys. And if you haven't already, we have multiple social media accounts that you guys can follow for updates and information, and mainly updates on those upcoming Discovery Labs. So on our Facebook, you can find us at Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Virginia. And our Instagram, it's just at CBNERR, and same with our Twitter account. So if you guys want to follow us and get some cool updates, see some cool photos, please, we would appreciate those follows. But it is my great pleasure to introduce you all to Kristen Sharpe. So she is a master's student here at VIMS. She did get her bachelor's up in New York in environmental science and forestry. So she is going to be speaking with us tonight about some of the research that she's done and how it applies to tonight's topic of poop in the ocean. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and then I'll let Kristen take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tara. All right. Oh, just kidding. I am not able to share for some reason.
Let's see.
I just made you a co-host. See if that will work.
Great. Yes. Wonderful. Okay, great. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Tara. My name is Kristen, and as Tara said, I am a master's student at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. I'm actually in my final year of 3 of the program, but prior to graduate school, I worked with Sarah at the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve for nearly 5 years, where I planned all kinds of education events, including Discovery Labs. So this is really fun to finally be able to participate as a presenter as a research scientist. So I'm really excited to share this with you all tonight. All right, so before we get started, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather maybe the elephant poop in the room is more accurate. So all animals poop, whether they live on land, like a giraffe, in the ocean, like a sea turtle, or in houses like you and I, they all poop. Poop's a natural and really important part of an animal's health and well-being, as well as an important part of a healthy ecosystem. And so tonight I'm going to be talking to you a little bit, and we're going to focus on the importance of poop in the ocean. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the general importance of poop. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research on zooplankton poop in the Chesapeake Bay. And then I'll end by telling you some information on how poop in the ocean is changing over time. So the first reason that animal poop in the ocean is important is that it's a source of nutrients. Nutrients are substances that are essential for the growth and maintenance of all life on Earth, including ourselves. So when we take vitamins, we're taking in nutrients into our body that our body needs to grow strong and stay healthy. And in the same way, poop can be an important source of nutrients for life in the ocean. In most of the open ocean, there's microscopic little drifting algae called phytoplankton, and they make up the base of the ocean food web. The phytoplankton are using sunlight, carbon dioxide, which is a gas in the atmosphere, and nutrients in order to grow. Now, there's one specific nutrient that's especially important called nitrogen. And nitrogen is a limiting nutrient. So that means that as soon as it's made available in the water, the phytoplankton quickly take it up. And when it's all taken up out of the water, the growth of the phytoplankton can slow or even stop. Now, animal poop is full of nutrients, including lots and lots of nitrogen that comes from the food that the animal ate. So when animals poop in the water, the nitrogen is then available kind of as a fertilizer that helps the phytoplankton grow. And the larger the animal, the larger their poop, as we learned with the blue whale, fun fact, and the more nutrients there are that are made available to the phytoplankton, which is one reason why marine mammals like whales and dolphins and seals are so important to a healthy ocean ecosystem. Poop can be an especially important source of nutrients in areas that historically have low nutrients. So for example, in Antarctica, humpback whale poop is incredibly important. It's a source of both nitrogen and iron that leads to phytoplankton growth. The phytoplankton are then eaten by krill, which are eaten by the humpback whales, and then that starts the cycle all over again. So this is a really important way that nutrients are recycled within the Antarctic ecosystem and supports the entire food web. Poop is also a really highly effective way to move nutrients from the ocean onto land. So birds and marine mammals in coastal regions, they'll go into the ocean to collect prey. So it might be fish, might be crustaceans, and then they return to their nesting areas on islands or on the mainland. And when they're settling back in their nesting areas, they poop. So they spread nutrients from their prey onto the land, which helps land plants grow. We call this type of poop specifically guano, and guano is released by seabirds, including penguins. So those are Adelie penguins on the left-hand side there, as well as marine mammals such as seals and sea lions, which are pictured on the right. And in some areas of the world, guano can actually build up in layers up to 1 meter thick on the rock, which is insane. That is a lot of poop, but pretty incredible and very important. The second reason that poop in the ocean is so important is that it's a source of food. And I know what you're thinking, that's really disgusting. But in nature, many animals frequently eat poop from other animals or sometimes even their own. If you've ever owned a bunny rabbit, you know this. So many marine animals that we're familiar with live in the surface waters, right? So those include things like whales, dolphins, sea turtles, and sharks. And when animals in the surface poop, it's released into the water and it's immediately available to be eaten by other animals. In this video, in just a few seconds, you're going to see this great white shark is going to go right up to this diving cage with divers, and it's going to take a poop. There it is. So it's pooping right next to the diving cage, and you can see how quickly those fish just swoop in to get those nutrients in the poop. But the poop doesn't just stay in the surface. It can also be transported to the deep sea. So unlike the sharks that kind of just release their poop into the water, there are certain types of animals that create fecal pellets. So it's almost like dense little nuggets of nutrients, including carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and all those good nutrients that animals need in order to grow. So these fecal pellets, they're denser than the water around them, so they start to sink down into the water. And bacteria start to break them down, which leaves like a sticky mucus covering around the fecal pellet that makes them bind together with other particles that are present in the water. So it might include like bodies of dead animals or algae cells or even molts of animals that have exoskeletons. And then these clumps of particles are heavier than the water around them, so they sink down all together, and they sink even more quickly once they're clumped together. And we call these clumps of particles marine snow, because as they drift down into the deep, they're kind of this whitish color and they look exactly like a blizzard of huge snowflakes. And this marine snow, you can see it in the video here, it sinks fairly slowly, but once it reaches the deep sea, it's a really important source of nutrients and a source of food in a place where it's very hard to find both of those things. Another important thing about poop is that it can be used as a tool in researching marine animals. Poop can actually tell us a lot about an animal. It can tell us whether it's male or female, if it's pregnant or it's recently given birth. So you can tell if it's nursing at the time because it releases hormones and compounds in the poop. You can kind of monitor stress hormones. You can find out if that animal's been in a stressful situation that may impact its health. And you can also monitor other hormones that tell you whether it's getting the right amount of nutrients in order to grow and stay healthy. And all of these things are really important in order to study animals that specifically are more at danger, whether it's due to human activity or just natural processes. So it's really important for conservation of species because we can learn so much about an animal without having to put it into any unnecessary stress or approach it at all whatsoever. There's some scientists that have even trained their dogs to be able to smell out whale poop. So they bring them on the boat with them, and the dogs can basically like orient them to where these big, like floating masses of poop are, and they just drift in their boat, scoop it up, and then they can study it. So you can learn things like where these animals are having their young, what they're eating, and you can protect the resources or the areas that are really important to protect those animals. And the final important thing that I'm going to talk about poop in the ocean is that it plays a really critical role in the global carbon cycle, which means that it's also really important in helping to regulate our global climate. And as I explain this to you, I'm going to explain it in terms of zooplankton because that's what I study. So the word zooplankton comes from two words, planktos, which means drifter or wanderer, and zoo, which means animal. So zooplankton are all the animals in the ocean and freshwater rivers and lakes that drift around in the water column. They can't swim against a current. So this includes teensy tiny little animals that you can just barely see with your naked eye that spend their entire life as plankton, including copepods in that red circle there, as well as the juvenile or young stages of a lot of the animals that you and I know and love that live in the ocean, including things like young crabs and young fishes. And the zooplankton group also includes all of the large animals in the ocean that drift around in the currents, including jellyfishes and salps and pyrosomes. So it's a really large group of animals, but they're incredibly important. So as we said, zooplankton can't move against the current, which means that they kind of drift around in the water from left to right. They can't really control their movement that way. But some types of zooplankton are really good at moving up and down in the water column for very long distances. So animals, including copepods, which you've talked about a few times here, krill, and also some types of fishes, including lantern fishes, they participate in a process known as diel vertical migration, which is basically a pattern of movement where the animals move up and down in the water column each day. The main reason for this movement is to avoid predators that use sunlight in order to hunt. So typically the pattern is that these animals will stay in the deep waters during the day and then move up into the surface at night to feed under the cover of the darkness. But I guess the question is, where does poop come into this and what does this have to do with climate change and carbon cycling? During the day, in the surface of the ocean, we have these microscopic algae that we talked about called phytoplankton, which once again are using the sun's energy, the carbon dioxide gas from the atmosphere, and those nutrients that we talked about to create sugars, which forms the base of the ocean food web. These phytoplankton are rich in nutrients, so they're a really good meal for zooplankton. But there's far too many predators in the surface waters during the day for the zooplankton to risk being around to eat them. So to avoid the predators, the zooplankton are spending the daylight hours in the deeper dark waters where the sunlight doesn't reach. And then at night, they come up to the surface to feed. And so they're kind of grazing down those phytoplankton at night. And then as the sun comes back up, they move back down into the deeper waters. And when they make it down to their daytime home, they relax and they digest all that food that they ate at the surface. And just like any other animal, as we talked about, zooplankton do poop. So they create those fecal pellets that we talked about. So all the nutrients, including carbon, that's not used to grow or reproduce is pressed into these fecal pellets, which they release straight into the water. And the fecal pellets are heavy. They sink down to the deeper waters. combining with other particles in the water to make that beautiful marine snow that we saw earlier. But sinks fairly slowly. It takes months or sometimes even years for these pellets to reach the deep sea zone, so the twilight zone where just a little bit of sunlight still reaches. But along the way, they're eaten by bacteria, zooplankton, or sometimes even larger animals like krill or deep sea fishes. Because of all of this heavy consumption, basically, and eating of the pellets in the water column, only around 20% of pellets that are created by zooplankton make it below 1,000 meters depth, so into the midnight zone where there's no more sunlight at all whatsoever. So the remaining pellets continue to sink down into the deep sea and into essentially sometimes even the sediments. So more and more animals continue to eat them, and only less than 1% of the pellets make it into the seafloor, where they can be eaten by animals that live at the bottom of the ocean, including urchins and sea cucumbers, as pictured here, or they can be buried into the sediments. And if they're buried in the sediments, they're removed from the system for thousands to millions of years. And this movement of animals and their pellets is a process, and it's a part of a process called the biological pump, which is a really important way that carbon is pumped from the atmosphere down into the ocean and ultimately removed from the environment. And it's estimated that if we didn't have the biological pump, we would have up to 50% more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And the reason why this could be an issue is because carbon dioxide is one of the major gases that contributes to climate change. So what is climate change? Well, we have our Earth, and our Earth is surrounded by an atmosphere. And within the atmosphere, there are regular levels of gases such as carbon dioxide or CO2 that are cycled naturally as plants use them to create oxygen, and then animals breathe that oxygen and release carbon dioxide when we breathe. These gases are often called heat-trapping gases because they trap heat from the sun and act like a heat-trapping blanket surrounding the Earth, which keeps it warm enough for life to exist on our planet. But what we're seeing happening is over time, as we're burning fossil fuels like oil, coal, and natural gas to power our lives, we're adding rampant or extra CO2 into the atmosphere, which is thickening that heat trapping blanket, causing more heat to be kept around the Earth for longer periods of time. This causes the temperature around the world over both the land and over water to rise. And this has a variety of effects, from heat stress and habitat shifting to increases in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. And so all of these changes together we call climate change. And they, of course, have profound impacts on all life on Earth, including in the sea. And so the more that we know about the carbon cycle, the better we are prepared to combat the effects and impacts of climate change. My research aims to explore the role that these zooplankton and their fecal pellets are playing in the carbon cycle in the York River here in Virginia. The York River is one major tributary that drains into the Chesapeake Bay, which is one of the largest estuary in the United States. I've been sampling monthly at 2 sites within the York River. So you can see that lower site at the mouth of the York River, and then also upriver, that blue marker, that's a mesohaline, we call it, site. So basically the salinity or salt content of the water is lower there. So I'm sampling in both of those locations, and each month I went sampling both during the day and at night in order to collect animals that were present during the day, but also the animals that had moved up into the surface waters to feed at night. And each time I collected a sample of animals to weigh for biomass, a sample to identify, to figure out which species were present in the water. And also I collected live animals for use in experiments. And so my experiments were aiming to figure out how much carbon the zooplankton are releasing with their poop. So I performed something called fecal pellet production studies. So basically I held some zooplankton captive in what I like to call plankton poop prisons, patent pending, where the animals are separated and contained in an inner jar with mesh on the bottom. And then that's placed inside a larger jar full of unfiltered whole seawater. So it's got lots and lots of tasty phytoplankton in it. So these zooplankton are able to swim around and they eat the phytoplankton, and then they create pellets in in response to that. And then those drift down through the mesh and into the outer container where I can actually collect them, filter it down, and then I can separate them out and I can process them for their carbon content. And keeping the animals separated from the pellet portion is really important because, as we said, animals will often eat their own poop and other animal poop. So I want to collect these fecal pellets when they're in their whole form, not broken apart by zooplankton. So what I've found so far is that the amount of carbon that the animals are releasing in their fecal pellets is really dependent on their size. So the smallest animals, they're releasing the most pellets per time. So per hour, they're releasing the most, but their pellets are much smaller, relatively speaking, and they have a lot less carbon than the pellets from larger animals. Whereas the larger animals are releasing less of these pellets per hour, but their pellets are chock full of carbon and are denser, so they're much more likely to make it to the bottom of the river than be broken down in the water column. And this differs a lot. It differs between day and night. So a lot of the larger animals will move into the surface at night to feed. So you actually see more carbon being produced at night than during the day typically. And then also it varies among seasons. So we have phytoplankton blooms in the spring and in the late summer in the York River. So after those phytoplankton blooms, kind of lagging right after is like a peak in zooplankton. And so we get a lot of pellets created and a lot of carbon cycling after those blooms. This information is really important to collect because it's important to understand how animal size can relate to the fecal pellet carbon production. So smaller animals like the copepods and krill, they make smaller and lighter pellets that drift pretty slowly compared to the larger pellets, which makes them more likely to be broken down in the water column than to be buried in the sediment. So that just releases the carbon back into the system and it doesn't remove it temporarily like it would if it were buried. Whereas larger animals like gelatinous salps on the left-hand side there, they produce large and dense pellets that sink much more rapidly, and they're therefore much more likely to make it to the sediments, which is removing the carbon from the system. So one impact of climate change is that we're seeing differences in the sizes of zooplankton in the ocean. So there's this relationship between animal size and temperature in cold-blooded animals like zooplankton. So typically they're smallest at high temperatures and they're largest at cold temperatures. And this is an example of an ecological concept known as Bergmann's rule. So therefore it kind of translates to most zooplankton being the smallest at the equator, and then they get kind of progressively larger as you move north and south of the equator towards the poles. So for example, copepods that are in the tropics are roughly 1/10 the size of copepods from the same genus in the polar regions. And so what we see is as the ocean is warming, that warm water is moving up and down away from the equator, kind of like little tongues of water moving. And these zooplankton are responding to that. So the tropical species are able to move north and south, take advantage of that new warm water habitat, whereas our polar zooplankton are kind of losing habitat because it's getting pretty warm there. So they're getting less and less habitat as they move further and further towards the pole. And so over time, we're actually seeing a decrease in the overall average size of zooplankton throughout the ocean, which, as we just talked about, it will lead to a decrease in the amount of carbon that's being removed from the system because they're making those smaller fecal pellets. This can have a huge impact on the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, which can kind of almost cause a positive feedback loop. So if we have less of the carbon being removed from the atmosphere, there's more in the atmosphere, which kind of causes the climate change impacts to be even stronger and more intense. And then in estuaries, they're really dynamic. They're constantly changing and they're heavily impacted by humans on a daily basis. We live here, we rely on it for our livelihood, all that good stuff. So the projected impacts, of climate change are even less clear than in the open ocean. And so I'm hoping that my research will provide information to improve climate change and carbon modeling efforts in the Chesapeake Bay, as well as kind of serve as like a baseline for future studies on how zooplankton communities and fecal pellet production are changing over time with climate change impacts. And with that, I am happy to take any questions. If you'd like to learn more about my research or stay in touch, I am on social media. I will tell you that I am not that active on Twitter. I still don't know how to use Twitter, but I'm pretty active on Instagram. So feel free to reach out. Also email me if you have any specific questions. But thank you so much for having me tonight. This was really great.
Thank you, Kristen. We do have some questions, so we're excited to ask you some of them. So somebody was just confirming that they move up and down to avoid UV, or can you explain why they move up and down?
Yes, so they're actually moving up and down to avoid their predators. So they stay in the deep waters during the day because their predators have eyes, right? So they use sunlight and light from the sun in order to hunt. So if they're in the deeper waters, they're kind of like covered by a layer of darkness almost. It's almost like camouflaging. But yeah, so they're staying in the deep waters during the day, and then they move up into the surface waters to eat at night.
And then we also had someone ask about CO2 levels, more specifically, like if, you know, our oceans act as a carbon sink, would we find more carbon dioxide near places like deserts?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So typically when we study CO2 levels, we're looking at them as like an average level, like an atmospheric level around the entire Earth. There can be regionalized, like higher levels of CO2 for sure. So specifically in areas like estuaries, they're very productive. So there's a lot of phytoplankton growing, and then there's a lot of animals that are eating the phytoplankton. So they actually create more carbon dioxide. So you can see in studies of CO2 in the water, like dissolved CO2, and also in the atmosphere, you can see like those peaks of production and things like that. So yeah, there is absolutely regionalized, and also like due to like volcanic activity and things like that, they release a lot of CO2 into the air. So you can see changes, but typically when we're studying it on such a large scale that we don't really necessarily pay as much attention to that.
The questions are rolling in. So another very important question. Wyatt would like to know, what is your favorite class at VIMS?
My favorite class? Mm-hmm. Oh, goodness. Oh, no, I hope none of my professors are watching. It's putting me in a very vulnerable place, Wyatt. I guess I would say I really liked biological oceanography because I love biology and all the living things that live in the water. And my advisor taught it. Shout out to her, Debbie Steinberg. But I also really liked estuarine ecology, it was called. So it was like all about estuaries and how important they are. And I learned a lot about all the processes that kind of like change the estuaries over time and how we're impacting them. It's really cool.
I kind of like this question. So Caitlin wanted to ask, how tiny can zooplankton be?
Oh, great question. So they can be very, very, very tiny. So zooplankton are split up by a lot of different ways. So there's holoplankton, which spend their entire life as plankton. And then there's mesoplankton. So they spend only part of their life as plankton. But then within the holoplankton, we also have different size classes. So there's microzooplankton, which are like smaller than 200 microns, which is about a fifth the diameter of your hair. So pretty small. And then we have the mesozooplankton, which is what I study. So that's from 200 microns all the way up to about 2 millimeters. And then we have macrozooplankton, which are 2 millimeters and up. So those are all the ones you're definitely going to be able to see with your naked eye. Most of the animals that I study, you can make them out in the water. Like if you look really, really closely, you can like just see little like white specks moving around in the water. But they can get super duper duper tiny.
Okay. Another question is, let's see. Is global warming changing ocean turbidity?
Ooh, that is an excellent question. And it is a very jam-packed answer. Yes, it is. In short, absolutely yes. So one of the things that's really impacting that relationship is that with climate change, we're seeing changes in like precipitation patterns throughout the ocean. And so a lot of the nutrients from land, when they come in with sediments as well. So one of the largest pollutants in the Chesapeake Bay is actually sediment that comes from land, because it's drifting down through the watershed and into the water when it rains, and when the snow melts in like New York even is part of the watershed. So we have a lot of sediment, and then that increases the turbidity, which is basically how clear or not clear the water is. So basically that means there's more particles in the water, so it's less clear, is what turbidity is for people who don't know. And so if we have more rain, we have more sediment that's being washed up, or into the water, I should say. And so it's increasing the turbidity, so making it more cloudy over time, which can really influence things like seagrasses. So not so much the phytoplankton. Sometimes the phytoplankton can be influenced, but they mainly just like hang out at the surface where there's a lot of sun anyway. But seagrasses, they're rooted at the bottom of rivers and coastal areas. So those seagrasses, they're really vulnerable to turbidity changes, because if it's really cloudy, they can't get the sunlight to penetrate down into the bottom where they need that sunlight in order to grow. So it's mostly seagrasses that really suffer from that, but absolutely, yes.
And then also, what types of penguins did you happen to see when you were in Antarctica?
Oh, okay. So I saw 4 different species. I saw gentoos, chinstraps, mostly adeles. That was the main one. And then we went to Chile, and then we take the ship from the tip of South America in Chile, Punta Arenas, to the Antarctic Peninsula. And on the way there, I was very lucky because I looked out and saw a rockhopper. That was fun. He was so cute.
Penguins, they poop quite a bit.
Yes, they do, and they smell so bad. You can smell them way sooner than you see them. Let's put it that way.
I think we have time for a couple more.
Yeah, I think we have a couple more. I don't know if you're going to know the answer to this one, but Claire and Maggie would like to know, what size is dolphin poop?
Ooh. I don't know, but I will tell you that they release it out into the water, just like that shark video that we saw. So their poop's going to be like, it's mostly like a volume thing, not so much like a size thing, but they make big poop clouds. Yeah. Not as much as the blue whale, and not as much as the sharks probably, but much more than a zooplankton.
So we'll have time for one more question. So David's asking, does agriculture runoff affect your studies? And for instance, like after rainfall, is there some increase in like nitrogen waste? And to kind of tie in someone else's question, like, does fecal matter and poop from other animals also increase turbidity and overall like water quality?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked a little bit about sediment, how that's a really large pollutant into the Chesapeake Bay, but the second largest are agricultural runoff, basically waste. So nitrogen and phosphorus, those nutrients that are in the poop, they run off into the water and they create algae blooms. So in the summertime, if you're local or if you live in a coastal region, you may notice that harmful algal blooms, so like those red tides, occur in the summer. And that's due to like a lot of runoff and also warm temperatures. So if we have warm temperatures and lots of nutrients, that's when we get those harmful algal blooms. And so that can influence human health and shellfish health. So you have to be like careful about the shellfish that you eat and things like that. But yeah, absolutely. So I'm not looking so much at that because I have only been sampling over 1 year. But that would definitely be something that could influence it on like a more interannual cycle. So sometimes we have really rainy years, sometimes we have really dry, like not dry, but like relatively drier years. So it influences actually the zooplankton that are present too. Like for example, this summer, there were so many sea nettles. I got stung all over my body. It was awful. We caught 50 in one net. But then like other summers, like there's none of them. Well, not none, but there's like much less of them. So that can influence all of this stuff that I'm studying as well, because they make the heavy poops that sink fast.
Mm-hmm. So if you guys have any other questions for Kristen that we didn't get to, she's going to stay on for a little bit longer. So if you guys want to send her a message privately through this webinar, you definitely can. She can answer those for you. But I do, before we get into our game, I do want to introduce you guys. And again, thank you, Kristen. Sorry. I do want to introduce you guys to Sophia and Maggie. So they are 2 undergraduate students at William & Mary, and they are our eco ambassadors. And as part of a class that they are taking and the credit that they receive, they've been assisting Sarah and myself in creating some additional resources for you all to enjoy for these discovery labs. And so I'll have them just briefly introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about some of those resources that they've created.
Hi everyone, I'm Sophia. I'm a junior at the college and I'm double majoring in biology and environmental science.
And I'm Maggie, and I'm a double major in anthropology and history. And we made some activities and little infographics for the Discovery Lab last month. You might have seen them. They got sent out with the email. And we've made them again this month. So I do a lot of the graphic design work for the infographics, and Sophia is a little bit more focused on the games sort of portion, but we're talking mostly about the carbon cycle and how poop kind of plays into that as our climate connection for this month.
Yeah, and we've been really excited about making these activities, and we're going to make the activities and infographics for the next 2 Discovery Labs as well. So we're super excited.
Thank you guys so much. They've been a great help, and definitely check out those resources they've made. They've made a really fun game and some infographics for you guys to enjoy this month. But we're going to go ahead and play our Let It Marine Snow game. So I'll go ahead and share my screen again for you all. And I'll get it in the proper view. There we go. So you all should be able to see my screen. So this game is called Let It Marine Snow, Let It Marine Snow, Let It Marine Snow. No, it's a little past Christmas time, but this is a pretty fun activity, especially with the amount of snow that has been occurring up here in Virginia. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. So Kristen definitely covered what marine snow is in her presentation. She did a great job in doing that. And so it's not quite like the snow that we see here on land. So again, it's all that organic material, dead plants and dead animals, and that sediment that they collect and fecal matter. And they group up and create this flaky material that can float down to the bottom of the ocean. And this is primarily found in the surface waters where there's a lot of sunlight. So that sunlight will help those phytoplankton, which eventually get eaten by zooplankton and other fish species, to create this marine snow. And those snow flakes, we'll call them snowflakes, can get quite large, several centimeters inside the deeper they go down. And they can take weeks before they even reach the bottom if they do get the chance to do that. And again, Kristen touched on this about why it's important. One being it is food for a lot of different critters. So whether the animal is filtering that marine snow out of the water or they scavenge it off the ocean floor, it is a form of nutrients for them and something that they can consume. And that detritus, that is a term you might have heard before. It's again, remains of dead plants and animals, that organic material, and a lot of bacteria will feed on that and exchange it to create carbon dioxide. And again, this all is part of that biological carbon pump, which helps convert all of that atmospheric and land CO2 and transfer it down to our ocean and to our sea floor. So it's all one giant system. So how this game is going to work is you guys are going to randomly pick 3 different numbers between 1 and 50. And it's going to be easier if you guys go ahead and write them down now. So you can pick your 3 favorites or just pick them randomly. And those 3 numbers are going to represent your snowflakes or your marine snowflakes. In each round, we are going to travel down through each ocean zone. And there will be slides where numbers will appear on that slide. And if you see your number on that slide, you just want to put an X on your sheet where you have that number. And the objective of the game is to make it from the surface all the way down to the deepest parts of the ocean. So Again, if you guys haven't already, go ahead and pick 3 random numbers between 1 and 50 and go ahead and jot them down. If you have a good memory, that works too. So we have to start from the tippy top. So the epipelagic zone or the sunlight zone. So this is also known as like surface waters. It's not very deep, even though 656 feet sounds deep. It's when we look at the entire ocean column, it's really not. And this is where we see most of our visible light here. And with that light, we also see a lot of heat. And so that heat creates a large range of temperatures for a lot of these animals that live here. And we have a lot of diversity in species in this zone as well. So these can be small animals like those zooplankton and phytoplankton we talked about, to larger fish species and even larger marine mammals. So lots going on in this zone right at the top. So you've entered that epipelagic zone, that sunlight zone. And so these are the numbers. So if you see one of your numbers up here, go ahead and just exit through on your sheet. So 15, 46, 33, 40, 4, 21, 2, 16, and 38. So if you guys see your number on this board, it means that you were eaten by a silverside fish. So your little marine snowflake, unfortunately, was consumed by a silverside, a pretty small species that we find. And they're called silversides because they do have that long silver metallic streak along the side of their body. It can help them really in schooling environments kind of hide from their predators, but unfortunately they were consumed by that silverside. Which brings us to our next ocean zone, which is the Mesoplagic Zone or the Twilight Zone. Not the TV show, this is an ocean zone. And this area of the ocean, it's 656 feet to over 3,000 feet. So still not very, very deep compared to other ocean zones. And we're not seeing a lot of light here. So there's some faint light from the sun coming in, but it's relatively dark in this area. And you also see a lot of really amazing animals here that have bioluminescent displays. So a lot of animals will use bioluminescence to fend off predators, or sometimes they're used in mating rituals. So a lot of these animals will utilize that bioluminescence in this twilight zone. And you also will find a diversity of pretty strange and bizarre looking animals here, from different types of cephalopods, so squids, like our beautiful cuttlefish there. But you can also find some different fish species as well. So in this twilight zone, if you see one of these numbers, again, you want to go ahead on your sheet of paper and just draw an X through that. So we have 22, 7, 36, 18, 41, 35, 5, 13, and 28. So if you see your number on here and you exit out on your sheet, unfortunately, you were eaten by a cuttlefish. So your little marine snowflake did not make it past this zone in the ocean. And cuttlefish are pretty cool species. So even though they have the word fish in their name, they're actually a cephalopod. And they use that brilliant bioluminescence display, a lot of different variations in their color and shape to defend themselves. So they're a really cool animal. So even if you were eaten by a cuttlefish, still a cool animal to get eaten by. Which brings us to the Bathypelagic Zone or the Midnight Zone. This area is 3,281 feet to 13,124 feet deep. So that's a pretty deep area of our ocean. It's one of the largest areas, and there is absolutely no light here. That's why they call it the Midnight Zone. It is pitch black down there. The only time you'll see animals is usually when they're using some form of bioluminescence or a light display. You'll see here like a sperm whale Even though you see in that photo there's light, these animals can dive down to really deep areas in our ocean to where there's no light at all, since they do rely more on so like sonar type of hearing rather than their sight. So you will see other animals that don't necessarily have light displays. And there's a lot of pressure, lots and lots of pressure in this area since it is so deep. And most of the time, some of these animals will be lacking in vibrant colors besides those lights. So they might appear more red or black due to the lack of sunlight that they're being exposed to.
Tara, we have a request. We lost someone for round 2. Could you show them the round 2 numbers really quick?
Yes. Thank you for letting me know.
Yep.
I had a feeling that would happen. So again, those are the round 2 numbers. So I'll go ahead and move back down to round 3. And you guys can let us know again if we're going too quickly, if I need to go back. So in the midnight zone, these are your round 3 numbers. So again, if you see these numbers on your sheet, you'll want to go ahead and put an X through those. So these numbers are 47, 12, 49, 1, 24, 31, 32, 8, and 42. So if you did see these numbers on your sheet, on your marine snowflakes, you were eaten by a vampire squid. So vampire squids can be found in this area of the ocean, and they actually get their name because of their appearance. So if you can kind of tell, these squid have this extra skin that extends from their body down to their arms and their tentacles. And it almost looks like a cape. So that cape is worn by a vampire. So that's why we call them our vampire squid. So pretty cool animal down in the darkest parts of our ocean. Which leads us to the Abyssal Pelagic Zone, or the Abyss. So it gets even darker than the midnight zone. So the Abyss being over 13,000 feet to almost 20,000 feet deep. And this water temperature is very, very cold. It's almost near freezing. And again, there is absolutely no natural sunlight that reaches down to this depth in our ocean. So since it is so deep, there's very few animals that can really thrive down in that area or adapt to that environment. But there are still species that have been able to do that over time. And then this area of our ocean is really considered, you know, the ocean floor, because 3/4 of our ocean floor is in fact the abyss. So we have different types of animals that can be found here. They can almost look almost alien in nature, but again, there's still life down in the deepest parts of our ocean. So in the abyss, if you see one of these numbers on this slide, again, go ahead and put an X through that on your sheet. So those numbers are 6, 43, 19, 27, 14, 48, 39, 20, and 10. So these are the marine snowflakes in our abyss that unfortunately did not make it because they were eaten by a frilled shark. And this is a species of shark. They are relatively rare. They were probably because they are in the deepest parts of our ocean. So it's pretty hard to get photos and, you know, live specimens. But these animals, they're called frilled sharks actually because they have gills that line their throat, and they have almost like red fringes along those gills. And if you look closely at the side, their mouth, those teeth that you see, they have these backward facing rows of teeth. And so they're mostly eating things like squid, but they can also scavenge on that marine snow because as it gets deeper, that snow gets larger in size. Which now means that we have reached the Bathypelagic Zone, or our trenches and canyons. So even though we were in the abyss, and that's what most of the ocean floor is, the true ocean floor and the deepest parts of our ocean are those trenches and canyons. So over 20,000 feet deep. The Marianas Trench, the deepest part in our ocean documented, is over 35,000 feet from the surface. So that is very, very deep. And people have gone there with the help of nice pressurized vehicles, but it is a very tough place to live, especially for a lot of different species. And that pressure is extremely, extremely high, 8 tons per square inch. So that's like having 48 jets sitting on you. So that is a lot of pressure in those areas of our ocean. But there is still life down there. They have adapted to live off of some of those vents that might be found. They tend to be very opaque in color, almost translucent. We also find different species that are burrowing into the sediment. And so those worm species, a lot of small species, but they're still able to live down there. So that brings us to our final round. So you've reached the those trenches and canyons. So if you see these numbers, go ahead and put an X through your sheet of paper. So those snowflakes are 37, 29, 17, 25, 3, 45, 34, 23, and 50. So these snowflakes, even though you've thought you've reached the very, very, very deepest part of our ocean, unfortunately, Cusk eel did eat you up. So a Cusk eel can be found, they're mainly found at those vents in those more volcanic areas in our ocean, but they're not actually an eel, even though they have that in their name. They're actually a fish. And so that fish species is named after a cusk or cusp fish, which is usually I think it's found in more tropical environments, but they have that same appearance of looking like an eel. But they can be found still in those deepest parts of our oceans where us as people might not thrive very easily, but they're able to. Which brings us to our finalists. So these are the 5 numbers that were able to travel from the surface waters to the very deepest part of our ocean. And so Kristen mentioned in a presentation, you know, it takes a long time to get there, but it's also, it's pretty hard to get there because there are lots of animals that might eat you up along the way. But the truth is, everyone is actually a winner in this game. So even though you found your number here, congratulations, but we all win. And this is the main reason why. So your marine snowflake was eaten, but that is not the end of your journey. And this is because of that biological carbon pump that Kristen talked about. So down at the bottom of the slide, we have our marine snowflake, which is you guys. And unfortunately, it might have been eaten by vampire squid, by our shark, by silverside. But eventually that animal is going to either decay over time or they might poop. And so when they do, that fecal matter is then converted back into marine snow. So basically, everyone who was eaten by an animal, you simply were just recycled back into that biological carbon pump. And then it starts all over again, just as a new marine snowflake. So that just gives you a good illustration about the journey of marine snow and how it travels through our ocean. But I hope you guys kind of enjoyed this little activity. This was actually, I'll give some credit over to Lisa Lawrence. She did this same kind of activity with sea turtle nesting. So it can definitely work with talking about the different life stages of different animals, but it really works well in this activity talking about the journey of marine snow going from the surface down to the deepest parts of our ocean. So if you guys have any questions about that activity, you guys can let us know. We would love to get any feedback or any ideas for future activities. But on that note, and if Sarah, if you had anything to add before we get into our last activity for the night.
Nope, I just said to stay tuned because we have one more game.
Yes. So if you guys joined us last month, we did a trivia game to wrap everything up. So I'll pull it up now. It's going to be through Kahoot again, if you're not familiar with that. So once I have it pulled up, I'll share it on my screen. Perfect. So you guys should see a Kahoot screen pop up. So if you want to pull out a different device, being your cell phone, it can be an iPad, it can even just be another screen on your computer. So you'll want to go to www.kahoot.it. And then once you reach that site, you'll want to enter the game pin that's listed up on the screen here. Once you do that, enter your username, and it will prompt you to look at my screen and you'll see your name pop up here. So I'm sure some of you have already played Kahoot and you're very familiar, but I will go over the instructions for those who haven't before. So Kahoot is a trivia game where you are ranked based on your correct answers and then how quickly you answer your questions. And so what'll happen is the question will pop up on my screen for you all to see. It will not pop up on your phone though. What will pop up on your phone are the options to the question because they all are multiple choice, okay? So you will enter the answer to your question on your mobile phone or the other screen, and it'll prompt you through that, but it will not show, you don't enter your answer on the screen that you're looking at now. This trivia game is called Scat Attack. So it's going to be kind of a poop ID game. And we are going to be playing for a CBNERR prize pack. I do want just to make clear that we would really like for our younger audiences to get more engaged with this and have the chance to play too. So if you're playing as like a family, if you want your kids to answer, that's great. But we'll be sending that prize pack towards the end. So we'll give a couple more seconds for some last minute folks to get entered in. And you should see your name pop up.
I can hear the excitement from my players downstairs.
Yep.
They're getting ready.
And again, with Kahoot, it is multiple choice. On your phone, you might see like a red triangle, a green square, a blue circle. It's not A, B, C, or D. So it'll look a little different, but cool. So we'll go ahead and get started since we have pretty much everyone entered. And again, you get points based on if it's correct and how quickly you answer. Our first question. So what animal do you think produced this scat? So time ran out, but the otter is the correct answer. So if you saw in that photo, there were almost what looked like grass in the scat. So that's kind of a good indication, but it can be kind of tricky when you're telling an animal just from the scat that they leave. So good job, Maggie. Our next question. Which animal produced this scat? Yep. So personally, when I saw that image, the first thing that popped in my mind, it looked like a giant tarantula, but that is in fact goose scat. Probably something we've all seen before all over sidewalks, near those ponds, but that is in fact goose. Cool, we have some people climb up. Our next question is, what animal produced this scat? Cool. So good job, guys. So it is going to be Coyote Scat. So their scat actually looks almost hairy. It might not actually look like scat or poop, but that's something that I had to learn while making this game, was what Coyote Scat looks like. Well done, guys. Lots of changes. Which animal produced this scat? So you guys answered that one pretty quickly. Probably something we're all pretty familiar with is, in fact, deer scats. They leave those little balls all over the place. So you'll see those in those grassy areas or in wooded areas as well. Nice. Got JoJo on a hot streak. So we have 2 more questions. This one looks a little different. Nice. So that is cow scat. So you might hear us say like a cow patty, but you'll find those a lot, especially if been to farms and areas like that. Well done. So we have 1 more question. Which animal produced this scat? Nice, good job, guys. So yeah, that is an owl pellet, actually. When I was in school, I got to dissect an owl pellet. You can find bones of things like mice in there. You can actually purchase them online and do your own dissection at home. There's tons of resources out there for how you guys can do that. It's a cool activity to do. But yeah, that was in fact an owl pellet. So we'll check out our podium. We have Sarah, good job. Dinos, well done. And Maggie is our winner. Nice job. And we have some runner-ups as well, but you guys all did great. I know that's a little tricky. I even had trouble making that, identifying some of that scat. I'm in no way an expert, but I hope after this, you guys are in fact scat experts now. Cool. So if you guys have, let me close that out so we don't hear that music. So I hope you guys enjoyed some of the activities we had and our great guest speaker, Kristen Sharpe. We want to thank her again for being with us tonight. If you guys have any other questions, you can email us if you were the winner, so Maggie can send that information in. And then we would love to have you guys join us for our next Discovery Lab. That will be in March. So we'll be updating guys about information and registration for that event. But we do want to thank you guys again. And if you have any questions, feel free to send us an email. We would love to answer that. You can follow us on those Facebook page and Instagram. And we'd love to hear from you guys. But thank you guys so much. Hope you enjoyed it.